Yeah, thanks so much for those prayers, and great to be with you again. I really love coming. I always get a bit of a buzz out of coming here. You're such a friendly bunch of people, so it's great to be with you again. You've been focusing a little bit, I understand, on the theme of discipleship. So I thought it'd be helpful to bring out one aspect of discipleship from Matthew's Gospel. To become a disciple of Jesus is to enter into a lifelong apprenticeship in living for the kingdom of God with Jesus as our master. I wonder if that's how you think about what it means to follow Jesus. Part of what it means to be a Christian is to be a disciple of Jesus. So we have to understand discipleship. Discipleship is not just something for leaders to grapple with. It's not just something that is done to us. We're not only called to be discipled by others, we're also called to do the discipling, aren't we? To be disciple makers of both ourselves and of others. Discipleship is about learning and training to be followers of Jesus. I think sometimes Christians can think about being a Christian as a kind of static identifier, or perhaps you think about it in terms of a relationship with God, but not one that is necessarily growing or developing, right? But according to Jesus, we are disciples. We are learning on the job, right? We don't do it perfectly. We make plenty of blunders, like apprentices can sometimes do. But we're on the job and Jesus is training us. And I think there is as much as ever a desperate need for discipleship, both here in Australia and around the world. There are places where people are turning to Christ in great numbers, but then just remaining unfed, untaught, undiscipled, untrained. And so there's this urgent need for authentic discipleship. So what does this training, this discipleship involve? Well, before we investigate that bit, it's important to understand that discipleship is not only something that happens in the formal setting, like formal instruction, like doing a discipleship course or a Bible study. You see, part of our discipleship may just involve asking good questions of those around us at morning tea about how they're going at following Jesus. When you do that, you say, how are you going in your faith? Right there, you are part of discipling others, do you see? So all of those things can include, talking to someone on the phone during the week, these opportunities are all opportunities for discipling each other. And so whatever gifts you have, whatever capacity God has given you, you can play your part in helping others to follow Jesus. That's what we're doing. We're called to do the discipling of both ourselves and of others. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a bit of a look at Matthew chapter 16. And I want to start with this passage that we heard read really well to us before by noticing Peter's fall from dizzy heights to the deepest depths. I want to start by noticing how Peter he falls from this glorious public recognition to the deepest depths of public humiliation. You see, how could it be that someone like Peter could get something so completely right and then only a short time later get something so completely wrong? When Peter gets it right, he receives perhaps the most praise Jesus offers to anyone during his earthly life. But in the next moment, Peter gets it so wrong that he faces perhaps the most terrible humiliation that anyone's ever had to face. Perhaps you can imagine a time yourself when you've been singled out for public recognition. Perhaps you were singled out to win a prize or an award. It might be some sporting achievement or some academic achievement or citizenship award. You might have been chosen to be school captain, for example. But you can probably think of a time when someone has recognised you, someone's put the spotlight on you for some kind of achievement. and you were placed in the spotlight and people took a moment to recognize your achievement. Can you think of such a time? Now, this one is not quite as fun to think about, and in fact, it might be a bit painful. Can you think of a time when you experienced some public humiliation or shame? What has been your lowest moment of being exposed, of maybe you made a public blunder? Perhaps you just made a real noob of yourself where something went really wrong for you. When you think about those moments, they really cut like a knife. I hate thinking about them. Can you picture that moment? Now, imagine that second moment comes hot on the heels of that first moment, of going from public praise and recognition, filling your sails with courage and confidence, and then the next robbing you of all of that in public disgrace. You can start to spare a thought for Peter here, can't you? Because in this passage we see Peter, he hits the highest high point that he's ever hit, only to reach that lowest low point. Pretty soon other people had also been called to follow Jesus, and Peter was now part of that specially privileged group of apprentices. And that group was moving around following Jesus, revering this towering figure, this teacher, this leader. But up to this point, Peter hadn't been especially singled out in the story of the Gospels amongst this group. He was really just one of the bunch, one of the pack. But they get to this key point in the Gospel, and Jesus says, well, what does he say? Who do people say that I am? Who do people say the Son of Man is? And the disciples, perhaps a bit reluctant, fearing to get the answer wrong, they throw in a few answers that they've heard other people tossing around. So some people say John the Baptist, others Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But then Jesus, he won't let them get away with that, will he? No, he presses the point. No, you personally. He looks them in the eye and he says, what about you? Who do you say that I am? You've been with me up to this time. You've seen me up close. You've heard my teaching. You've watched me interact with other people. You've seen the things I've done. Who do you think I am? And at that moment, and as Peter sometimes does throughout the rest of the gospel too, Peter jumps in. He goes for it. And he actually arrives at the critical breakthrough in understanding. It's Simon Peter who gets it. It's this defining moment. It's the first moment in the gospel where someone other than the demons has recognized Jesus for who he is. You are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that's a massive breakthrough. It's a massive breakthrough in Jesus' revelation of himself to the disciples. It's a massive insight for one of Jesus' disciples to have arrived at this conclusion. As readers, we've been hearing about this conclusion from the beginning of Matthew's narrative, if you've read it through. But until this point, no disciple had arrived at this conclusion. And at that point, well, you might go, well, maybe Peter is speaking on behalf of the group. Maybe it's not really Peter's personal moment. Maybe everyone's arrived at this conclusion and he's just their representative. But then you have a look at what Jesus says next. Did you have a look at what Jesus says next? Let's have a look. It's on the screen there. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah." That is second person singular there, you. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." In response to Peter's insight, Jesus singles him out for this special honor. "You are blessed because my Father has chosen to reveal that insight to you particularly." this very moment, Peter, you've had a direct line with God. You've had a personal, utterly unique encounter with God in this moment, in this critical recognition of me as the Messiah. And so at this moment in history, this Galilean fisherman, Simon Peter, has grasped the most essential, most basic truth needed for all humanity in all time. Jesus singles him out in front of all his friends, in front of all these other disciples. I'm saying to you, you are the one blessed with this most critical insight. Now, keeping in mind what Jesus has just said to Peter, perhaps the greatest public honour in all history up to that point, fast forward a few moments to verse 23, where Jesus now says to Peter in verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Right? The founder of the church, stumbling block. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Now, could you get a more dramatic reversal? A moment ago, this guy had had a direct line with God, the Father himself, a heavenly insight, momentously blessed. And now Jesus addresses Peter as if he was Satan himself. So completely demonic were Peter's words in that moment. Peter had spoken as a child of heaven, and now he speaks as a demon of hell. He had spoken as the very voice of God himself. Now he speaks as the very voice of Satan himself. There's this dramatic, stark contrast between the two, isn't there? Between his words of life and truth and glory, and now of darkness and evil and horror. It's hard to imagine a bigger contrast in the way that Jesus addresses him. Jesus effectively says, now you're a stumbling block to me, right? Get out of the way. You're not thinking straight. You've got it so wrong. You're trapped in this depraved worldly perspective. You're not thinking like God at all. And can you imagine that in front of everyone? The humiliation that he faces there. Well, what has changed? What could possibly have happened in those few verses in between, those only two verses, that could explain how such a reversal came about? Well, let's have a look at those. It's verse 21 on your screen there. From that time, this is what happens in the middle bit. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." So what's happened? Well, Jesus has begun explaining for the first time what kind of Christ or Messiah he intends to be. He's explained what kind of Messiah God has planned from the beginning of time. The Messiah that's revealed in the Old Testament scriptures, in the Psalms, for example. So we heard a bit from Psalm 22, remember? So that psalm starts, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it's all about this single individual who is insulted and mocked and ridiculed and scorned. And Jesus says, that's the kind of Messiah I am. Psalm 22 is a Davidic psalm, right? It's a messianic psalm in that sense. But it's one who is abandoned by God. See, what had not happened necessarily in the people for the people of Israel is that they hadn't yet connected the idea of this conquering king that had been promised, the Messiah, the Christ, who would rule all the world forever. The Messiah of Psalm 2, the Messiah of 2 Samuel 7, the Messiah of Psalm 110, this conquering king, they hadn't connected that with the suffering individual of Psalm 22 or of Isaiah 53. And the same suffering servant who suffers as the innocent one, taking the place of the guilty paying the price for the sins of others. That's what Isaiah 53 is all about. And so Jesus impresses this upon them. You are going to have to come to terms with my dual character here. That is, I am the Messiah, come to bring God's victory, God's rule, God's kingdom over all the earth eventually. All evil will be eradicated through this one king. But I will do it by suffering and by being killed in Jerusalem. And so that's exactly what he spells out here. He has an appointment in Jerusalem to meet his destiny, and he knows that this appointment in Jerusalem involves rejection. It's going to involve distress and suffering and execution. But he keeps going because he knows it's the plan of God. He knows that it's the certain promise of God that it's this way that is the way of salvation. He knows it's the way to win God's victory over sin and death and judgment and set people free and establish peace and joy for the people of God. It's the way of bringing the kingdom. It's the way of bringing forgiveness of sins, of reconciliation with God. And Jesus knows that all that can be achieved by him in laying down his life, by losing his life, by giving away his life, that is how the kingdom will arrive. You see, it's one thing for us to recognize Jesus as the king, right? The Messiah. But if you're only carrying with that the baggage of expecting a triumphant king who's going to do nothing but kick goals, then I imagine once you hear about a Messiah who suffers and dies, then that's not going to fit with your understanding, is it? But according to Jesus, if it doesn't, then you really don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about Jesus as the Messiah. You really don't know what you're getting yourself into to confess him as the Christ. You really haven't understood the Old Testament according to Jesus, and you really haven't understood what Jesus' Messiahship is all about. And that becomes really apparent in verse 22. Peter can't imagine those two figures coming together. And so he says, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Now, before we go any further, I want you to imagine just for a second that Peter was persuasive at that point for Jesus. Imagine if Peter was in a position here such that, in such a way that he could prevent that kind of future for Jesus. Imagine Jesus responded rather than with his rebuke. He said, "Well, actually, you're right, Peter. But what do I need to do all this suffering and trial for? Why should I go through with all that? Why don't we just skip all that to the point where I'm enthroned in heaven and transcendent glory? Tell me more about this idea that I can be the Messiah without suffering." That sounds pretty good. I signed up for something different, but the more you talk about it, the more I like this idea. But see, what's the result if that were to happen? Well, there'd be no salvation, would there? There'd be no forgiveness. There'd be no real freedom for God's people. There'd be no kingdom. There'd be no resurrection. Death and condemnation would be the fate of us all. And of course, that would destroy Christianity. There'd be no Christian gospel as such. Because the way that Jesus will achieve his victory and become enthroned is precisely by dying as a sacrifice, as a substitute for the sins of his people. He dies in their place. He takes their judgment that they deserved. That's how Jesus establishes the kingdom, by reconciling people to God. That's how the victory is achieved. Notice the very end of that passage, verse 28. There it is on the screen. "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." See, the kingdom will arrive within the lifetime of at least some people who are right there in front of him. The kingdom is coming, and is coming very soon in Jesus' book. But it will only come as Jesus goes to Jerusalem and suffers and dies. The kingdom arrives through Jesus' death and resurrection. We know that there's still a not yet component of that. We still see evil in the world. We don't yet see everything under Jesus' feet. We're still waiting the final consummation of all of that. But it arrives decisively through the suffering and the death of Jesus. And Peter can't accept that. He won't accept that. Peter's got another plan. And we can sympathise with him. And clearly Peter's ideas are out of tune with what God is doing. Peter's understanding of Messiahship is completely at odds with how Jesus understands his Messiahship. Peter's got it completely wrong, fatally wrong at this point, fatally for himself if he keeps thinking Jesus is a Messiah without suffering. But it's also fatal for us if we're convinced that Jesus can be our King and without the suffering component. It's a fundamental mistake for Peter to misjudge what kind of Messiah Jesus intends to be. But this leads to a second critically serious mistake, because if you don't understand the kind of Messiah that you're following, then you can't understand what discipleship is, and you can't understand what discipleship looks like. You see, if you think that discipleship means following a powerful, popular leader, and that by hanging around him, you're going to gain status and influence and street cred, and you're going to be recognised as someone as significant and prominent yourself, that the glory of Jesus is somehow going to rub off on you and it'll be refracted through your life. Well, Jesus is saying to us here, well, you're tragically mistaken. Because according to Jesus, that's not what Christian discipleship looks like. The pattern for the Messiah was suffering first and then glory. And so the pattern for Christian discipleship too is suffering first before the glory. Now, there's a dark place in my heart that despises all this. I don't want this. I don't want a life of suffering and difficulty. I want the triumph. I want the victory, and I'm pretty sure that's what you want as well. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to face opposition from this world. But true Christian discipleship is not going to be some kind of endless triumph and victory for us, overcoming our enemies, overcoming everything that holds us back, reaching our every personal potential. If you think you're going to walk through life as a winner because of the power of Jesus infused in you, well then you need to reconsider again the kind of Messiah Jesus is, and reconsider what he says that it looks like to follow him. He came into his kingdom by weakness, by humiliation, by degradation. And if you think you can eliminate those elements from being a disciple, then again, well, you've misunderstood the nature of Christian discipleship. Jesus explains all this down in verses 24 to 26 for us. He lays it out clearly. Oh, no, that's not there. Okay, 24 to 26. Did I have it on the screen? No, I didn't. Okay, never mind. 24 to 26, I'll read it to you anyway. Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done." And then Jesus said to his disciples, I've just read that bit, that's fine. So that's the passage where Jesus teaches us about this connection between his messiahship and our discipleship, right? His suffering and our discipleship. Do you see the direct line that Jesus draws there from what it means to be a Messiah, to suffering and die in his own description of his own vocation, to what it means to be a disciple, to give your life away, right? To take up your own cross. So the pattern of his own suffering, taking up his own cross, losing his own life, becomes the pattern for all disciples. And he recognizes that there's nothing nothing of such worth that's worth exchanging for a soul, for giving up on that relationship with God, walking in fellowship with God, the creator of the universe. There's nothing worth giving that up for. In Jesus' mind, there is nothing in the world that you would trade in for that, because it eventually means losing everything, doesn't it? And so Jesus says, follow me. Follow him. Just follow him. And what you can do is you can, read through the rest of Matthew's gospel and follow him from that point. If you were to do that, follow him and see what it is for him to be the Messiah. Watch him as his people turn against him. Watch how he responds to them when they do that. Watch how people collude against him. Watch how they try to trap him in his words, how they turn on him and they look for any opportunity to turn him over to the authorities. Follow him and see the false charges they bring against him, the way they mock him, spit at him, reject him. Follow him and see the rejection that he suffers. Watch while he takes up his cross, while he has his feet and hands nailed to the cross in order to eliminate him, to just get rid of him, to stop any further pesky interference into their lives, to stop him coming at them with his claims of authority on behalf of his Father. As we follow him through the gospel, you start to see what it means to be a disciple. There are people right at this moment throughout the world who are needing to make this calculation, make this decision about whether they are to follow Jesus or not. People who are going, can I trust Jesus with my life? And some people are making that decision under the threat of death. They're going, people want to kill me, and if I renounce Jesus now and disown him, well, they'll let me go, and I can live to see another day. I can go back to my family. They won't kill me if I renounce Jesus. But if I stand firm for Jesus, they will take my life. And so they need to do this calculation. Does Jesus really know what to do with my life when my life is taken from me? Will he give it back to me? Can he give it back to me? Does he really have the authority and power to bring me safely into God's kingdom? Does he really love me so deeply to restore my life beyond death? If I lose my life in this moment, will I be saving it? Or will I lose the only life I've ever been given? There are people in the midst of making that decision in the world at this moment. And how they make that decision will determine whether they lose their life or whether they're going to be allowed to go home and live another day, have another night with their family. As Jesus approached death himself, he too had to make that choice. He had to make that choice. Jesus had to make that calculation. He had to say to himself, does my Father really know what he's doing with this plan? Will my Father really keep his promise? Am I safe with the Father? If I give my life for the Father's plan, will the Father give it back to me? We've got to be careful not to water down the anguish and the tears and the anxiety Jesus suffered as he went through this. That night in the garden, he wrestled with what was about to happen. He was facing the horror of death and the God-forsakenness. And Luke 22 says this, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And yet, despite the tears, despite the anxiety, despite the night of anguish in the garden, despite the sweating blood and the wrestling in prayer, he could say to himself, I can trust my Father. He knows what he's doing. And that's what discipleship is for us as well. It's knowing Jesus as your suffering Messiah. It's knowing that Jesus, as God's appointed ruler of the universe, truly has the power to restore your life. But also that he loved us so much that he was willing to suffer and give up his life so that you might not lose your soul, but be with him forever. That's the requirement of discipleship, isn't it? That you know Jesus as he is. It's not enough simply to name him and then carry on with the identity marker. I'm a Christian, right? It's not enough even merely to identify him as the Messiah, the great King, the ruler of the world. We need to understand what kind of Messiah Jesus went on to be. We need to know him as the one who bore that cross. He took our cross, that humiliating death. We need to know him as the one whom God approved of in his death through his resurrection. We need to trust Jesus as God's ruler even when people don't like us, even when people hate us, even when they oppose us, they give us a hard time, perhaps in ways that make you want to give up. Sometimes in ways that threaten us. But this is what it is, isn't it? Denying ourselves, taking up our cross, considering your life as not really belonging to you anymore, but really belonging to him. So that every aspect of ourselves is given to him to serve him, to bear fruit for him, to bear testimony to him, and to bring glory to him. That's going to prove costly for us. In following Jesus, you might face loss of sleep, financial hardships, workplace pressures, if you're going to be honest about following Jesus, family difficulties. You'll probably find it exhausting being a follower of Jesus at times. As a disciple of Jesus, you'll probably face relational conflicts. As a disciple of Jesus, you may face betrayals and all kinds of hardships. But when you do that calculation, well, where would I be if Jesus didn't make that journey to the cross? If he didn't lose his life so that I might be saved? And then you can, when you kind of do that calculation, you can see that there is only one way to go, isn't there? There's only one way to live. Discipleship then is having that same mindset of Jesus. And all of a sudden it makes sense then to put your reputation at risk in the workplace, to put your family relationships and your friendships at risk in being honest about your faith, being honest about your master, to make decisions that are difficult and painfully inconvenient, to make decisions that will lead people to excluding you and saying not things are nice about you behind your back. And in light of the kind of Messiah that Jesus is, it makes sense to be this kind of disciple that follows the same pattern of Jesus. And so this is the fundamental requirement of any disciple, that we know and understand Jesus as the suffering Messiah. There's so much at stake that Jesus says, what good will it be if someone gains the whole world yet forfeits their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Jim Elliot, you might know this quote. He said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." What is it for you that most threatens a life of discipleship? What is it that's most tempting for you to trade your soul in for? Perhaps some experience, some relationship, some possession that life offers. Is it really worth trading in your soul for that? And if not, if it's not worth it, if it really is worth following Jesus, suffering and all, then today, our only way forward is to go, all right then, today, tomorrow, and every day, I'm going to commit myself to being a disciple of Jesus, to walking in his footsteps, with whatever suffering that brings, because the Messiah has come. He has suffered and he has died, and I will be with him in the kingdom of God forever. I'm going to pray. Our Heavenly Father, you know the things that are a temptation for us, which threaten to draw us away from a true discipleship, from truly following Jesus as our master, from following him in the way that he walked, taking up a cross. And our prayer is that then you would give us a genuine confidence in this suffering Messiah, that as we reflect on the great lengths that he went to for us, as we think about his death on the cross for us, that you would enable us in your mercy by your Spirit to take up this call of genuine discipleship. And with the one life that you have given to us, we ask that you would make us fruitful in Jesus' service. And wherever that takes us, whatever we find ourselves doing, we ask that you would use us in all our weakness and frailty and the blunders that we make. And that just as Jesus brought life to us, we ask that we may play a role in bringing that life to others, in being part of that great discipleship program, in discipling not only ourselves but others around us too. And we ask this for Jesus' sake, that all the glory would go to him. Amen.